The next type of UX process I want to talk about is what's called UCD, user-centered design. And that's been around probably longer than even Agile UX has been. And this is the idea that what you're going to do is you are actually going to pretty much design the entire user experience before any software development takes place, knowing that you're going to have to make modifications once the development of the app or the software or the product gets going. But you go ahead and do your user research, you do your high-level design, you do detail design, you test it, and you iterate, and you have created then a vision of what this product is going to be before any of the product gets created. That's my view of what user-centered design is all about. Now, you could, the software development could start anywhere in there, but basically you're doing your thing, creating the user experience before the software development has even, or the product development has even started. Advantages and disadvantages. Typically, the UCD, doing user-centered design like this, doing all your research and all your high-level design, your detailed design, your prototyping, your testing, doing that all up front takes a fair amount of time. So you've got to time that out because you'd rather hold off the development part until you have finished your vision. So you've got to plan that ahead. So if the development group comes to you and says, we're ready to go, and that's when you're starting to do your user research, you're going to have a tough time doing the whole UCD process before they want to get going on programming on something. Now, you could do this user-centered design process, which involves, like I said, user research. So you would do personas, you would do scenarios, you do task analysis, you would design the high-level conceptual model, you'd design detailed screens. You could do that all before any of you could do that all and then use that as your input to Agile, or use that as your input to any kind of software or product development process. So it's just isolating the design of the user experience, and that is done as input to the development process. Now, an advantage is that you get lots of time to really iterate and think about what the user experience should be. The disadvantage is that when the development team gets going, there's going to be realities come up and changes in the constraints, and you will not have taken those into account during your user experience design because you didn't know what they were. So you're going to have to make lots of changes to the user experience design. If you're not okay with that, and then don't do a full UCD before the product development starts. But if you're okay with that, then it's a wonderful way to go because it gives that vision to the software development process ahead of time. So we've talked about Agile, we've talked about UCD. Let's talk about two more that are often invoked when we talk about user experience. One of those is Lean UX, and that's based on the Lean startup ideas. So kind of like Agile, Lean startup is not a user experience process, it's a product development process. But because a lot of people are doing Lean, then people have started coming up with Lean UX. Now, when I've read some descriptions of what is supposedly Lean UX, it looks exactly like user-centered design, the UCD process I just talked about. It doesn't look any different to me. So sometimes I think those are exactly the same thing. But when you're doing a Lean development process, not the UX part, but development, what you're doing is kind of like Agile. You're chopping things up into pieces, but basically you're starting with a hypothesis and you're going to test that hypothesis. You're going to collect whatever data you need to test that one hypothesis. You're going to learn from what your test told you, and then you're going to keep going with development and keep going with testing hypotheses. And so lean UX is doesn't mean, by the way, it's not lean because you're doing very little of it. It's just lean because that's what the process is called. But in lean UX, you would be doing a minimal amount of user research up front. You would just be researching. Let's say that they're developing a new product and they've decided to test out the idea that people would like an app that allows them to, I don't know, let's say it's before Uber and Lyft came out, and or let's say it has to do with driverless cars. It's an app that lets you call up a driverless car to come and pick you up. I'm waiting for that one. And so they decide to test the hypothesis that people would prefer to call up a driverless car rather than a car with a driver. I mean, they have just this one little hypothesis they're going to test. And so you would be doing just the research you needed to do in order to create just a little bit of the interface they want to create in order to test one little hypothesis. I used this once with a client who wanted to have, they had product videos at their retail website. And the question was, should we make the product videos more prominent? So the hypothesis was if we made the product videos more prominent, people would watch them. And if they watched them, they'd buy more product. So that was just a little hypothesis. So we just did enough research so we could design an interface in which we changed the timing and the placement of where the product video showed up. And then we tested that out and we learned from it. So it's just this idea that you're doing just tiny, tiny little bits of research, tiny bits of design, tiny bits of testing. You're not designing the whole user interface. You're not doing research on the whole user interface. You're not testing the whole user interface, just these little pieces as you need them. So that's lean UX. And I know I'm going through these quickly, and we have, courses on more detail on all of these, but I just want to give you a flavor. So we've talked about Agile UX. We've talked about user-centered design process. We've talked about lean UX. One more that I want to talk about is called design thinking, and you may have heard of this. And this comes out of IDEO. It came up, that's a design company came up with this idea. And so there's design thinking, and then there's the UX that goes with design thinking. So design thinking, again, is not a UX process. It's a whole development process, I guess you could say. Like lean is a development process, like agile is a development process. And design thinking is about deciding what to design by really looking at what people want or need. And so it's a philosophy as well as a process. And it's a little bit different than lean. It's a little bit different than agile. And so the UX that goes along with it is also a little bit different. It's similar to lean in terms of the UX because, again, you're going to be designing the UX just in small pieces. There's a lot of user research, though, that goes into the design thinking process. So I think the difference in the UX side, if you're working on a project that's using design thinking, is that there will be an enormous amount of user research that will happen up front before you need to design anything, which actually is useful as the user experience designer. You'll have a lot of information about the users and what they want and what's important to them, because that's built into the design thinking process. So is one methodology better than another? As I said, they all have similarities. I think as long as you're doing some amount of research, if you can't do research, you at least got to know what your assumptions are about the target audience and what they want. So you've got some amount of that user research. You've got some times when you're doing design. You've got some times when you're prototyping and you're testing and you're iterating. As long as you've got that in there, that is really the user experience design process.